My next guest is Congressman Dave Schweikert from Arizona. He is a senior member of the Joint Economic Committee. He thinks the economic recovery is falling short, especially on the jobs front. Congressman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about jobs. We also have to talk about inflation, the new numbers that came out today, and whether or not that is further exacerbating the job market that we're seeing today and what you're seeing on the front lines in Arizona.
And look, and my comments in regards to jobs is more the differential of actual purchasing power. When you realize even some of the posting from March was 8.5% inflation annualized, but then you take a look at many of our submarkets. I mean, Arizona, year over year, the January to January number was 10.9% in the Scottsdale, Phoenix area. So we saw some decent wage gains. Some of the job creations were paying well, but an individual in that job was poor by the end of the year. And my fear is that is actually what sets off the expectation of recession by third, fourth quarter, or beginning of next year, is that loss of purchasing power. So it is sort of the nature of what could you and I do from a policy standpoint, other than the Federal Reserve squeezing liquidity out of the markets? What could you and I do that boosts jobs and availability and productivity, but also has a dampening effect on inflation? And that's why my personal fixation has been, what do we do tax code regulatory wise to move investments? It's almost like your last segment, into highly productive uses of capital that could hit the market quickly.
So what needs to be done in the short term? And right now, with Democrats controlling the House, the Senate, and the White House, your message to the Democrats is what?
Part of me first wants to say, when even some of the leading Democratic economists a year ago were begging them, do not throw more kerosene and matches onto the kindling that the Fed had left us. And maybe that's already been litigated enough. So now if I came to my Democrat colleagues and said, what can we do immediately? There's some quirky ideas, but they are economically somewhat sound. Could you take middle-class individuals and say, if you have some cash in the bank, we're going to give a special spiff. It only exists for the next 6 months to put money into a retirement account. We'll let you use after-tax money, and we'll treat it like an IRA or Roth, because that way you pull liquidity out. On the other side of the ledger, could you do sort of a depreciation kicker, sort of the expensing we did after the 2017 tax reform, to businesses saying, if you'll set aside capital and immediately put that into items, plant and equipment, software that make you more productive. Because if inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods, you can do two things. You could use some fiscal policy, not monetary, fiscal, to withdraw some cash out of the system, but put it into places that help people's retirement futures, economic futures. And the other side is some incentives to move to productivity, make more stuff, provide more services. And I think some of that could happen quickly. But it would require a lot of our Democrat colleagues to admit that their fiscal policy from last year was the match that set off the kindling.
Congressman Schweikert, inflation is high across the country, average 8-9%, but it's even higher in Arizona. Why?
In some ways, you've actually been partially covering some of this today. If your poll question, if I get to choose where I work, wouldn't you love to work in the Phoenix Scottsdale area? Look behind me. It's the lifestyle is wonderful. The political climate is, from a tax and policy standpoint, is easy to have a small business. So it helps set off some real movement in our real estate prices. So if you look at the differential, why did the Phoenix area have such a high inflation rate? It was housing and our fuel costs. That was where the real differential was.
So what worries you the most as you look at where we're heading this year with inflation now in some parts of the country in the double digits? And we've been talking the last couple of hours about what is a growing labor shortage. Employers just having a very difficult time trying to fill those positions.
What worries me the most is actually a bifurcation in society. The working poor are actually getting poorer almost every day. I think there's a misunderstanding of how crushing inflation is to people, to individuals, to families, where a lot of your income goes to that housing piece, that fuel piece, fuel piece. And for folks who are in the upper middle class and higher up, if you own assets, inflation hurts. But most of your house, your other assets sort of move along with inflation. So you're not falling poor. And if inflation continues, we're going to start to see some really uncomfortable numbers on a big segment of our retirement repopulation that their savings are becoming devalued. So that's one of my worries there. On employment, there was actually some interesting little factoids in last week's employment numbers. We've talked about the Great Resignation, which I've never been completely comfortable with that as a title or definition. But we saw some inklings of those who chose to retire early coming back into the labor market. Mm-hmm. Now, is that because they're seeing their purchasing power being eroded, or because there's such a demand for their talents and labor? So that's another thing Republican and Democrats could be doing, is how do you very aggressively encourage older workers saying, we need you, we want you? How do you also then, the really one that's befuddled many of us is young males. How do you get them to actually enter into the labor market? Because they're substantially underperforming. So you have this sort of tails of the curve, and there are some policy suggestions that actually might encourage those populations to participate.
And Congressman Schweikert, I should attest you can bring some of that Arizona sunshine here east, because we've had a wet spring thus far. I want to ask you a final question and frame it in economic terms. You are a member of the Joint Economic Committee, but it clearly has become a political debate. Some of the states, New York and California, that basically shut down and been slow to reopen, have seen a different level of economic activity than, say, Arizona and Florida. From an economic standpoint, not a political standpoint, can you address that?
I want to make sure I'm not sounding sort of rhetorical, because some of the actual research is going to take years. Mm-hmm. How much of that was capital moving to places where it had a place to go? How much of that was talent picking up and moving? How much of it was just people with children wanting to be in a place where their kids actually weren't sitting behind a laptop? So there's no questions that there's lots of inputs on why states like Florida, Texas, Arizona have seen a fairly healthy demographic economic movement, where states that were very aggressive in their shutdowns actually see more than just the economic movement. I'm going to be fascinated when we start to see what are the mental health, what are the long-term capital investments, a lot of the other precursors to a stable economic growth. And we don't have all that information yet. We just sort of have the top line migration and investment numbers.
And that really is one of the fascinating aspects of what we have been living through over the last 2 years, and so much to study as we move forward. Congressman David Schweikert, he's joining us from beautiful Arizona, a member of the Joint Economic Committee in Congress, also the House Ways and Means Committee. Congressman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.